you and lunch, so I will try and make this concise. So my topic is, I've written a book about framing, and it's got a couple of chapters on game theory in it. And so I thought that I would try and put something together that addresses some of the themes of the conference. So, but it's not moving. Yes, it is. Okay, so we've got discussions of collaboration and coordination and game theory that raise a whole bunch of issues about how to relate individual rationality and collective rationality, individual intentions and joint intentions. But typically, these are not debates that are explored in the context of how oppressive norms emerge and how they're maintained. And we've seen a number of perspectives on the emergence and maintenance of norms and group identity. And I think I want to provide a sort of complementary perspective to what we've been listening to. And what I want to do is to sketch out a framework. I think calling it a game theoretical framework is too fancy, but it's a framework within reflection on game theory for thinking about how group identities can emerge and how group identities can be sustained. And I'm not working within evolutionary game theory. I try, as a general rule, if I can't figure it out on the back of an envelope, I steer clear of it. So I'm working in a more kind of classical approach to game theory. And then what I'm really interested, though, is tools for evaluating the rationality of group identities. And something that I think it's important to bring out, and I've got a vested interest in bringing this out because I'm very interested in frames, is that there really is a framing issue here, often in how we think about coordination and collaboration game theoretically. So in philosophical discussions of, overworked things like the prisoner's dilemma, we've typically got group identities and group thinking as framed very positively. So we see them as collaborative solutions to coordination problems. We see team reasoning and things like that as presented as alternatives to sort of crude and individualistic maximizing. And you've got long works trying to show, like David Gautier trying to show that the crude approach to the one-shot prisoner's dilemma to the repeated prisoner's dilemma is mistaken. There's a richer notion of rationality that's grounded in a sort of a sense of collective reasoning. But from the perspective of the topics of this conference, there's room for a different perspective here. I mean, discussions of racism, discussions of discrimination typically take a less rosy perspective on the issue of group identity. So one of the things that I think it's important to think about is how you develop tools for thinking about, like, when it's appropriate to promote group thinking and when it's not appropriate to promote good thinking. It's not a universal phenomenon. It's a very context sensitive phenomenon. So starting off with a couple of familiar background points, we've got a lot of common interest games, games where there's a sort of salient outcome that's maximally beneficial to the participants. And I'll just talk about two-person games. Lots of common interest games that seem to have obvious solutions, but game theory doesn't tell us how those solutions can be rationally reached. Usually because there are multiple equilibria and there's no sort of uncontested tool for selecting between different equilibria when you've got things like Stag Hunt and that have got two Nash equilibria. And then you've got dilemma type games. People talk a lot about the prisoner's dilemma. I prefer chicken for various reasons, which I can frame in a lot of different ways. But in those dilemma type games, real people often make decisions that come out as irrational on standard game theoretic canons of rationality. So let me start off by talking about Rousseau's Stag Hunt, very familiar to many people thanks to the work of Skirms and others. So it's typically attributed to Rousseau, but if you quickly scan the passage from Rousseau, which is the only discussion from the only discussion of it that you find in Rousseau, and if you can extract a payoff table from that, then you are a more attentive reader than I am. And anyway, there's the payoff table. You've got the option of collaborating on a stag hunt. That's beneficial for most, or you've got the option of diverging from the collective stag hunt and going for hare, which gives you slightly less good outcome and no outcome for the other person. And if you both go for hare, there's a limited supply of hare, so your payoff is somewhat less. So in this sort of situation, you've got the outcome where the situation where you both hunt stags. That's a pure strategies equilibrium because neither player can do better. So you've also got a pure strategies equilibrium in the situation where you both hunt hare. And there are various ways in which they're different. One of them is payoff dominant, and the other is risk dominant. And some people argue that payoff dominance is somehow more rational than pursuing risk dominant, and other people answer the opposite way. And it's all pretty inconclusive in my opinion. So one of the things, a very fruitful approach to these sorts of problems about equilibrium selection and the clash between the collective and the individual in game theoretic context is a cluster of ideas that were developed by Michael Bacharach a couple of decades ago before his death. And I think, if I've achieved anything in my book on frames, it's directing attention to two things that I think have been really neglected. And one of them is the work of Michael Bacharach, and the other is the work of Frederick Schick. And if you say who, then yeah, that's kind of my point. So Michael Bacharach proposes a model of what he calls team reasoning, and I'm just going to present the simplest form of it. There are more sophisticated versions, but the essentials are captured in these two ideas. So if you're engaging in what he calls mode P reasoning, or the simplest type of team reasoning, what you do is you look at the joint act profile. So you don't just look at your bit of the payoff table. You look at the payoff table for yourself and all the other players, and then you rank them using basically a Pareto criterion. I'll get to that in a minute. Then you take yourself to have reason to perform your component of the optimal act profile. So, there's more sophisticated versions of this. You might ask yourself, well, that's all very well. Why should I have a reason to do my, to do my share of an outcome, of producing a joint outcome that is Pareto optimal when I've got not necessarily complete confidence in the other person? So you can sort of make this model more complex and more realistic by adding in the probability that other people are going to be team reasoners and so on. And you get various versions of what he Bacharach calls circumspect team reasoning. Anyway, so just to quickly make sure we're on the same page about Pareto optimality, if you're dealing with common interest games, then they typically have a profile, a combination of plays that is Pareto optimal. And basically, Pareto optimality is just the impossibility of any player improving her own payoff without making another player worse off. So if you're playing the stag game, then stag is Pareto optimal, hare is not, and the joint cooperative solution or outcome, it's not a solution technically speaking, in Prisoner's Dilemma is also Pareto optimal. So going back to the framing thing that I started at the beginning, a lot of the discussions about team reasoning and in things like Prisoner's Dilemma are framed as debates about the reasons for preferring Pareto optimality, which is viewed as a sort of pro-social kind of outcome, to the individualistic game, the I reasoning that that leads to the mutual defection outcome. So that's basically Bacharach's idea, is that team reasoning involves looking at a payoff table, not from your own perspective, but from the perspective of the team, and then ranking the outcomes according to Pareto-based criteria, and then doing your share of the doing your share of the outcome that is most favored on that Pareto ranking. So the most obvious question that you might have about this is, does this not have all the virtues of theft over honest toil? I.e., has this not just simply stipulated a solution to the problem? And I can sympathize with that. I mean, it seems to yield the right answer. And I say the right answer relative to a certain set of assumptions, which I don't necessarily share, but it does seem to be something of a conjuring trick. And in particular, there's no explanation of when and why players should engage in mode P reasoning. And nor is there any account of how mode P reasoning can be a rational response to a decision problem. So so it seems as if we're not really being given an alternative to the standard solution concepts of normal good old decision theory. So Bacharach's got an answer to these things, and it's not totally satisfactory, but here's what it is. He says that we're basically engaging here in a different type of reasoning. It's team reasoning. It's not individualistic reasoning. And you get team reasoning, or mode P reasoning, or circumspect team reasoning when players identify with the group. And in games we're considering here, that's a group of two. And this is why I'm interested in it, or one of the many reasons I'm interested in it. Group identification itself is a framing phenomenon that is primed by certain features of the decision situation. All right, so about halfway through, good. So this is what Bacharach says about it. Group identification is a framing phenomenon. Among the many different dimensions of the frame of a decision maker is the unit of agency dimension. The framing agent may think of herself as an individual doer or as some part of a collective doer. And then he continues. The first type of frame, we've got two frames, the I frame and the we frame. The first type of frame is operative in ordinary game theoretic individualistic reasoning, and the second in team reasoning. The concept clusters of these two basic framings center around I, she, he concepts and we concepts respectively. Players in the two types of frame begin their reasoning with the two basic conceptualizations of the situation, as a what shall I do problem and a what shall we do problem. So if you think about the transformation that's involved in moving from the I frame to the we frame, it's really got two different dimensions. And the first dimension is a dimension in agency, in what the relevant agent is taken to be. So in the team reasoning, in the we frame, the agent thinks of herself as a component part of a collective agent, of a team agent. And at the same time, we've got a transformation in the payoffs. Not in the payoff table, right? The numbers all stay the same. The amount that you will get in all the different outcomes stays exactly constant, but you've got a change in the way in which you evaluate that payoff table. So you've got a shift basically from an individual utility function to a group utility function. Now I flag this now as, this is always going to come up when people are discussing new ways of thinking about old games, the standard objection is, well, you've just changed the game. And I just want to flag here that I think actually you haven't changed the game. The game is exactly the same. The payoffs are exactly the same. You've changed the way you frame the game. And there's a real difference between changing the game and changing the frame. And that's a common occurrence across many, many different contexts. I focus on game theory as one area and where this I think is important, but they are multiple and manifold. So Bacharach doesn't think that the we frame is something that you can think yourself into. I do, but he doesn't. And he doesn't think that it can be assessed for rationality. He thinks it's a psychological thing. So it's something that's psychologically primed. And it's primed in situations that have two characteristics. So the characteristic of common interests. So you've got common interests when you got a couple of states of at least two states of affairs, and in one of them, the interests of both are better served than in the other. So you can see that Stag Hunt, Prisoner's Dilemma, Chicken, all the classic two-person games, two-player games, common interest games. And they also have this other feature of strong interdependence. So each player perceives that they will do well only if the other person does something that is far from as short. So interdependence. Don't confuse this with strong independence. That's a different thing. All right. So are we done? Well, not really, in my opinion. And the first reason is that the Pareto criterion is completely flawed. It's completely flawed for a range of reasons, one of which is that it doesn't work in zero-sum games. And I don't know about you, but most of the games that I play are zero-sum. Because in a zero-sum game, every payoff profile is Pareto optimal. That's the definition of zero-sum. Zero-sum is that one person can't do better without the other person losing. But Pareto optimality is also a flawed criterion because it doesn't actually help us with our equilibrium selection problem, because we've got interesting and important games that have multiple Pareto optimal equilibria. One of them is my preferred game, Chicken, which we'll look at in a bit. And then the last reason for disliking Pareto is that it doesn't allow for anything that looks like a fairness-based distribution of goods. Or it places such strict conditions on a fairness-based distribution of goods that it's pretty hard to see how it could be achieved. So that's the first problem. And then I think there's another problem which is actually related to that issue about fairness, which is that the version of team reasoning proposed by Bacharach gives us no tools for thinking about when the we frame might be appropriate and when it might be inappropriate. Those two primes, those two different types of priming, group thinking, team reasoning, are present in many situations where you do not want to encourage team reasoning. And I mentioned briefly the sort of Hutu-Tutsi type case. This is not the team reasoning that I think you want a model of rationality to be encouraging. So there are many cases, the discrimination cases, racism cases, all of these are ones where it seems to me that the primes are there, and your job as a rational agent is to resist them, not to succumb to them. So what I'm interested in is whether there are tools for reasoning across frames. And this is not something that I think is restricted to thinking about game theory. This is something that is an incredibly important way of dealing with political polarization and a whole bunch of other sort of topical things. So ideally we would have some sort of an account of how an agent might, in some contexts, reason her way out of the I frame into the we frame. This is the pro-social bit. This is where we don't want to be, a room full of economists. We want to be a room full of good people. But in other cases, we also need an account of how an agent might go the other way and resist the call of the we frame. We don't want to, we don't want to be massacring ethnic groups, and we don't want to be discriminating. We don't want our in-group, out-group thing to take over our reasoning. So I think that what this means is that we need a way of thinking about that contrast between the I frame and the we frame that is much richer than taking it as a contrast between individualism and altruism. So if you think about long-running debates about the prisoner's dilemma, these are typically framed as the emergence of altruism through repeated prisoner's dilemma, whether you can provide an argument for being altruistic in a one-shot prisoner's dilemma. But you can construct lots of interactions that have the format of a prisoner's dilemma, where the joint outcome is really not desirable. The issue is not individualism versus altruism. It's I frame versus we frame, when in some contexts I frame is entirely appropriate, and in some contexts we frame is entirely appropriate. And really we want some way of thinking that's going to help us achieve that. So some background from the book that Michaela kindly alluded to. So I spent a lot of time, this is the sort of very quick version of a few chapters. So we've got in standard decision theory, preferences are treated as representations of choice. There's not a whole lot of psychological depth in decision theory, but obviously in reality, and at the moment in America, people divide themselves into the ones who believe in reality and the ones who believe in an alternate reality. And I'm one of the ones who believes in reality. And in my reality, choices are made for reasons, and reasons carry weight for the agent relative to particular framings, not just of the decision problem, but of their emotional interaction with the world and of their own values. The frames, I think, are like tortoises. They go all the way down. So framings are kind of interwoven with complex patterns of emotional engagement and complex patterns of valuation. So one possible tool for reasoning across frames is through anchoring reflection in the values that frames reflect. And I am going to give you a couple of sketches of how that might work, and I hope that we can, make some more progress on that in the discussion. But one candidate that I want to be thinking about is the idea of fairness. It seems to me that fairness is a value that is implicit in many people's responses to different situations and to different decision problems, even when those responses are diametrically opposed to each other. Fairness is something that can be framed in multiple different ways, as can decision problems. And those ways of framing fairness and the ways of framing the decision problem are often very closely interwoven. And what that means is that there's some potential here for finding some independent ground that will allow you to reflect across different frames and across different worldviews, really. So I want to start off by thinking about this kind of general approach, how it might work in one direction, because I think there's a mechanism here. A mechanism, again, it's probably too fancy a word, but anyway, it's the one that's on the slide. So I'm thinking about situations where an agent, reflecting on the I frame, so comes to see that what's really motivating her payoff table, the valuations that she attributes to the different joint outcomes, her share of the different joint outcomes, is really a concern for fairness. So when I think about the way in which this payoff table is presenting itself to me, I think that what's driving my own responses is a concern for fairness. But then once I've abstracted that fairness from the frame, I might reason myself into thinking that a different frame actually provides a better expression of that same value. So that process whereby an agent might bootstrap herself from the I frame into the we frame in certain contexts, right? This is not a general rule. It's just something that might work relative to certain particular framings and certain particular values in certain particular decision problems. So here's an example. It's a version of the chicken game. I like what I can believe to be the oldest occurrence of chicken in the history of world literature, which is in book 23 of the Iliad. And it's during the chariot games that Achilles convenes after the death of Patroclus. And Menelaos and Antilochus are duking it out. And they get close to a narrowing in the path where if both of them go through it, if both of them try to go through it, they're both going to crash and the chariots will get destroyed and the beautiful horses will be damaged and so on. So they've got options, two options exactly. Each one can either drop back or they can continue pressing forward towards mutual destruction. So the problem is created by Antilochus because he pulled his chariot up parallel to Menelaos as they approach the narrows. So there you see the familiar chicken payoff table. We've got two asymmetric outcomes. Those are the two pure strategies Nash equilibrium. We've got what you might call a cooperative outcome. That's where they both drop back, not at the same level, obviously, right? Or they're going to both crash just slightly later. And then the outcome where they both press forward and it's disaster. So one reason I like chicken is because there are three Pareto optimal outcomes, the two asymmetric outcomes, and then the symmetric outcome that is not Nash equilibrium. So now imagine that you're a reflective Menelaos, and you may have difficulty with that idea because if you're an enthusiast for the Homeric world, you'll know that reflection is not high on the list of the Homeric versions, but just imagine that you are a reflective Menelaos. So you have a strong aversion to the outcome where you drop back and Antilochus presses forward. And you ask yourself why. So the real Menelaos just cares about winning, but you are a reflective Menelaos. So it's not just that you don't like losing. You think that what has happened is that Antilochus has eliminated the fairness of the contest. He's basically bullied you into a position where the fact that you've got the superior horses cannot win the day. But then thinking about that, you think, well, maybe the other asymmetric outcome is not that great either, because that's not fair, even though I'm the beneficiary of it. So if I'm going to be a consistent reasoner about fairness, then I ought not to favor my most preferred outcome ought not to be the other asymmetric outcome. So then, as a reflective Menelaos, you might arrive at the position where you discount both asymmetric outcomes, and then in effect you've arrived at the we frame. So that's an example of how you might reason yourself in one direction. You might start from the I frame and reason yourself into the we frame. But I want to close by emphasizing that I'm not proposing that this is something that you should always do. There are perfectly good ways, there are many situations where that is not the appropriate response. And in fact, what you ought to do, what rationality I think demands you to do, is that you go the other way from the we frame to the I frame. So I want to make that point with a different game, which of course isn't a different game. It's exactly the same game. It's just framed differently. So this is the overstaffing game. So imagine a sort of, a company where the unions are strong, and we've got a small department that's got A and B working in it. They've got two options each. They can coast, they can just, tootle along doing the minimum amount of work and get to the end of the day, or they can really, put the pedal to the metal and really, go attack the work in front of them. The problem is, if they both work, then the manager is going to realize that the office is overstaffed. He's going to override the unions, and both A and B are going to be fired and replaced by one person who will do what's required. So there are two asymmetric outcomes where one coasts and the other works, and the person who works will be rewarded more because they're going full out. Well, the one who coasts will at least get to keep her job, his job. So this is basically, it's exactly the chicken situation. But I think here you want to go the other way, or here you might go the other way. So you might start in the we frame. So you just imagine you're this sort of good union type person. You're coasting along. You agree with your co-worker that both of us are better off coasting. There you are, sitting in the we frame. You think that's the fairest in the sense that it gives the equal outcome for both of you. You can have long lunch breaks and so on and so forth. There's no differential pay, but that's okay because you've got your jobs. But then you think, well, what's driving my reasoning here is the basic value of fairness. And now surely I need to think about fairness a little bit more broadly. I need to think about the company. I need to think about the shareholders. And I also need to think about the fairness from the perspective of opportunity. So different people need to have different opportunities to flourish and to work and to be rewarded more and so on and so forth. And then from that perspective, you might come to think that, well, the asymmetric outcomes are preferable. The collectively beneficial, equal symmetric outcome is underwritten by an impoverished notion of fairness. When we make that notion of fairness richer, then it starts to look like as if the asymmetric ones are preferent. Now, with that type of reasoning, we basically thought our way back into such a person has thought their way back into the I frame. So let me wrap up. I think that's my 35 minutes. So in a nutshell, what I want to suggest is that there is room for an approach to game theoretic reasoning that distinguishes the I frame and the we frame, but that does so in a way that is richer than what Bacharach suggests, and in particular in a way that recognizes that the rational appropriateness of team reasoning and individualistic reasoning is very much frame dependent and context dependent. And then I also hope that you will at least give some thought to the thesis that there are tools such that in certain contexts, you might be able to reason your way from one frame into another. Although I don't believe, fortunately, that there is any rational requirement that if you start in one frame, you have to end up in another. This is context sensitive all the way down. So I'll just end with a picture of my book, and I'm not sure whether Kaylin is here, but she did mention that she was very proud of the pinkness of her book. And I would just say, well, my book is pinker than yours, I believe. But there was some discussion yesterday about how you categorize colors. So it may be that this is not actually pink, but something else. I don't know. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. So the floor is open for, okay, I see Kaylin I think is first.
Okay, sorry I don't have my video on today. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to invite you to say more about fairness, because as I'm sure you're aware, there are really different cultural standards of what counts as fair. And so in these kinds of solutions to the prisoner's dilemma, where it's like, well, just make your utility my utility, I always wonder how people are going to respond to that, there's some cultures where you make use of all sorts of different asymmetries regarding status or gender or race or whatever to determine what counts as fair. And so entering a we frame, number one, it might not get us the outcome that we sort of pre-theoretically think of as the fair one for a lot of people in a lot of cases. And then number two, you know, sometimes within cultures, there are really different perceptions about what's fair from kind of group to group also. So it might not kind of solve coordination problems and things like hawk dove or bargaining games. So yeah, I just wanted to invite you to kind of say more about that.
No, those are all great points, and actually, I very much agree with all of them. So to step back, I mean, I think I was pretty careful not to propose any solution to any game. I think that what I was saying was that fairness can function as a tool for ranking different outcome profiles, different payoff profiles relative to frames. And of course, in different frames, different conceptions of fairness might be appropriate. So I'm totally sensitive to the idea that it doesn't even need to be in different cultural contexts, it's just in different situations. You know, it might seem appropriate, just to take a very simple contrast, to move from equality-based notions of fairness to equity-based notions of fairness. So I'm completely on board, I think, with everything you said, and it just allows me to reaffirm my emphasis on making things frame relative and frame sensitive, and not looking for the solution to this abstract problem, but seeing a particular prisoner's dilemma or a particular chicken as a schematic representation of a particular context dependent situation. And in some of those situations, one notion of fairness might be more applicable than another. And then we can have a discussion about it, right? And the decision maker can have a discussion with herself.
Yeah, good. I didn't mean to imply that this was some challenge to your account, but just rather a sort of chance to extend it.
No,
or say more rather.
Appreciated.
Okay, Anton has a question.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. So that's something I have to think about. So I have a more clarification question. So do you think about your theory as a normative theory or a descriptive theory? So if you think about the stag hunt example, then it's clear we all want to end up in the Pareto efficient equilibrium. But
sorry, where do we want to end up in the Pareto efficient?
In the Pareto efficient equilibrium, because we get more meat. But the criterion of risk dominance by Hassani and Seltness, I remember it was developed in response to experimental evidence that people who don't know each other, who have no prior trust built up, they tend to end up in the risk dominant equilibrium, so the worst one. And so to understand, so you presented it as if you say we should think in this I and V frame terms. So how do you understand this? Is it a normative theory, or where you think we should think like that, or is it a descriptive theory that says how people behave?
Am I allowed to say neither? Because I think that's probably where I would like to go. So backing up a little bit. So when I presented Bacharach's theory, I think he's very clear that he's presenting a descriptive theory. He wants to save the phenomena, as it were. So he wants to provide a way of thinking about how people react to payoff tables that will accommodate experimental evidence. Like, partly it's what you've recommended, partly it's the fact that people do seem to manage to solve matching pennies type problems and so on, and to converge on certain types of equilibrium. Sometimes they converge on solutions that are not equilibrium. So as far as he's concerned, he's offering a descriptive theory. Now, I would consider myself to be offering something more like a meta theory. So offering a framework that outlines different ways in which people can think normatively about different decision problems. So I'm not going to propose that people adopt the we frame as some sort of universal rule. I'm not even going to propose that people adopt the Pareto outcome in Stag Hunt. I think it all depends on how the game is framed. I'm pretty sure that if I sat down for 5 minutes, I could think of a Stag Hunt in which it would be intuitively irrational to take the Pareto outcome. And partly what I was playing with the chicken game was to try and illustrate that point. So what I want to do is to give a way of thinking about payoffs and payoff tables and values and preferences that will give some sort of toolkit, so that in individual situations, you can think about sometimes whether the I frame is superior to the we frame, or the we frame is superior to the I frame. But that's all a long way of saying neither.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Francesco.
Hi, well, thanks for the talk, which made me think a lot, and partly because I'm also thinking and writing about these issues. So you will receive an unsolicited paper soon, but the question is not about that.
I can make that. I can falsify that by asking for it.
Okay, but the question is a little bit different. So here's the question. So it seems to me that your strategy is exploiting the notorious ambiguity in the term reasoning, which, you know, on the one hand, you know, means giving reasons, and on the other, especially in standard decision theory, is interpreted as trying to figure out what is the best means to achieve your ends once you have already taken, you know, everything into account. Now you're using values, basically, like fairness, as a reason-giving device to solve the reasoning problem in the second sense, which is, you know, what to do in a certain situation. Now, this seems to violate, you know, the fundamental principle in traditional choice theory, in standard choice theory, which is that preferences should reflect all the values. I mean, so they're basically all things considered rankings of the options based on all the values that you happen to endorse. Now, so let's, I mean, I'm not saying this, you know, as a critique. I mean, you know, there are a lot of flaws in traditional game theory, and, you know, maybe this is one problem, I don't know, but just to follow, you know, what this reasoning leads. I mean, if you do take into account fairness when you face a game like the Prisoner's Dilemma or Chicken, then basically what it means is that you're not playing that kind of game, but you're playing something probably like a high-low game, which, by the way, is one of the games that motivates Bacharachs and substance and so on, you know, team reasoning. Well, at that point, so if what you're playing really is high-low, then the Pareto principle becomes, you know, again, a plausible tool that you may want to use to solve the problem, right? So because you know, a lot of your concerns about the Pareto principle do not apply to high-low. I mean, high-low, if anything, is the game where using the Pareto principle to solve the problem makes sense. So I just wanted to know how you would react to this kind of reasoning.
Yeah, I think, I mean, lots of great points there, and let me start at the end. So, as I think I said about halfway through, I want to resist the charge of having merely rewritten the game into a high-low. But to explain why I want to resist that charge, I'd just like to take a little bit of a step back, and say what my beef is with traditional ways of thinking about preference in the theory of choice. And I'm going to enlist Lenny Savage as a co-conspirator here, because as you remember, like in the Foundations of Statistics, he only gives one example. It's the example of the breaking the omelets. And when he discusses that example, he says, well, this example works precisely because it's what he calls a small world. So a world where, in his definition, you can look before you leap. So in other words, the decision problem is completely defined for you. You know what the options are, you can calculate the consequences, and you can attribute the probabilities. People often make a fuss about the probability piece of it. I think that's the less problematic piece, because like Savage, I think that most of the interesting problems we face are not small world problems. And that's not because it's difficult to attribute probabilities. It's because what is not clear is what the actual outcomes are. So I think that in decision making, an important part of that process is actually the process of constructing the decision problem. And that process is going to involve interpreting the different outcomes. So as it were, interpreting the payoff table. And it's in that process that I think you engage in the reflection that might lead you into shifting from an I frame to a we frame. So to put those 2 points together, the payoff table stays the same. The numbers are the same. I mean, a high off, if you write it down, a high load game just looks different from a game chicken or a stag hunter or any of these other 2-person games. But in any social interaction or decision problem more complicated than an omelet type example, I think that we all have to engage in a process of how we frame the outcomes, how we frame the decision problem, and that it's that extra bit of reasoning where I think these issues and opportunities arise.
Okay, I think I'll have to read your book.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, we have a question.
Expensive, $24.95 for the hardback.
A question from Ole Blomberg, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you. It was a very interesting talk. So I wonder how your account relates to Bacharach's work. So are you sort of assuming sort of Bacharach's theory and adding the values? Because I was thinking you were not talking about a group utility function or group preferences. Yeah, so I just wondered, kind of, is it just that, or not just, I mean, I'm not trying to belittle it, but is it that you think that fairness, the value of fairness and how it's expressed in different frames, that gives us a sort of grounding for a way of translating individual preferences to group preferences? Is that how I understand it?
I'm not sure. See, Bacharach's enough of a traditional game theorist not to talk in terms of group preferences. So when I wrote group utility function, I see where you're coming from. I probably should have framed that, presented that slightly differently. So he's presenting a view where you as an agent are considering whether you should act according to a ranking of profiles, outcome profiles, that is a group ranking or an individual ranking. So, the only criterion that he offers is a Pareto criterion, and for the reasons that I mentioned, I think that's not helpful as a universal rule. In some cases it's going to work, in some cases it's not. So that's one dimension of variation from Bacharach. Right. And then the other dimension of variation is the one that came up in the earlier question from Anton, that he really is offering it as a purely descriptive theory, and I want to go beyond that.
Right. I had can I ask another question? Yeah. So I was just wondering. So do you think that the I frame and the we frame can also express other types of values for, I mean, like loyalty or compassion or something like that, and we can? Yeah,
no, I certainly want to say that. I just picked up on fairness because it's I thought it was an example that would work in this particular context, and so it proved to be, because we had a number of other talks on fairness.
Okay, thank you.
Kaylin, did you have another question? Because, oh, okay, one new message. Okay, Francesco. Please.
Yeah, I have another question. Maybe you mentioned this, but I might have missed it. I mean, one of the things that the psychological trigger of the frame does for Bacharach is to solve the meta coordination problem that you have with team reasoning. So the meta coordination problem is that in many cases, it really does make sense to reason as a team member only if you think that the others are doing the same.
Right.
And you know, if it is a sort of brute psychological propensity or dispositions that is triggered by the situation, I mean, this problem, you know, in a lot of situations is sort of solved automatically because you don't spend ages sort of, you know, thinking about it. I mean, of course, you know, he also has this theory of what is it called? Not cautious, something
circumspect.
Like that. Circumspect team reasoning, yeah. Right? But in any case, you know, sort of, you know, postulating a kind of brute disposition certainly helps. So I was wondering, I mean, in your case, how you solve this issue, because I mean, you know, fairness may be a value that you endorse, and it helps, you know, in your reasoning. But how do you know that others are also caring about fairness?
Right. So Bacharach's solution to, or his you know, he approaches a solution to that problem with circumspect team reasoning, where you basically assign a probability to the other partners in the interaction being team reasoners. Now, since he's operating with this purely stimulus-driven model, he's not considering the reasons that you might have for being a team reasoner. So he's not going to put a parameter in the theory for the likelihood that other people are going to be motivated by fairness, or even that they're motivated by fairness understood in the same way that you might have it. But that would be the way you'd have to develop that theory if you wanted a formal representation of it. You just have to have more parameters where he only has one.
Right. Are you pondering, Francesco? Do you want to continue?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
So yeah, well, taking the time, I have a sort of tangential remark. It's not. So I'm thinking of frames from the literature on metaphor, on you know, ways of kind of seeing something, you know, seeing the rabbit as the duck, or
right,
sort of the coloring of one's, as it were, reasoning that alters our perception of certain categories. And I'm thinking those kind of frames are sometimes very sub-personal, and they just come upon us, you know, or in situations where they're appropriately primed and so on. But the kind of frame that you talked about today is a very kind of, you know, reflective. So it's guiding our reasoning in a different way than those other more implicit ways of frames working upon our beliefs. So I'm wondering, in a way, it feels like it's a qualitatively different type of concept than the one used in metaphorical understanding, or even you might think that when I talk about certain categories that I'm slurring or thinking in derogatory ways, I'm sort of still applying a frame that is, you know, implicit and kind of not under my control. But you make use of the frame in your example of the Menelaos in a very reflective way.
Well,
is there...
So the reason that example was reflective is because what I wanted to give an example of is the possibility for a certain type of reasoning about frames. But it doesn't follow from that frames themselves are always reflective. And in fact, in many ways, they're not. And so part of the challenge is, I keep saying that decision problems are not they're not given. They are, you solve decision problems relative to framing, but you don't necessarily provide that framing yourself. That framing could come from your social context, or it could come from your group, or from the way in which it's structured by the version of reality that you happen to like, in to put it in contemporary terms. But what I want to emphasize is that there's an opportunity for reflection on those frames wherever they come from.
Yeah. So I got it. Yeah, it's more of a tool that helps us guide the reasoning,
right?
As opposed to just being. Ollie has a follow-up.
Yeah, I was just thinking, should we think about reasoning from the I frame to the we frame, or the reverse direction, as a way of priming? I mean, are you thinking that this psychological process is something like priming yourself, or can you sort of directly reason yourself into?
I think you can do both. I'm
right.
Generally pluralistic. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is how you deal with people whose framing is just fundamentally different from yours. And I take an example of, this makes more sense in American context than the European context, but it's two people who disagree fundamentally about whether children should be given the opportunity to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in schools at the beginning of every day. This is kind of a hot topic, cultural topic, and particularly in my corner of Texas. So the one way, and so your job, say you're a diehard flag person, you think that you frame the Pledge of Allegiance in terms of the Constitution, you think it somehow reflects the thoughts of the framers, you think it endorses the basic underlying enduring principles of the Republic, and so on and so forth. I just think that's all nonsense. So, but my challenge is to try and think my way into your frame. And part of what I need to do is to start priming your reactions, right? I need to put myself in situations where I will see the power of the rhetoric, whatever it is that you find so influential. And that's part of the reasoning, right? When you're trying to negotiate a complicated interaction with someone whose perspective on the world is just fundamentally alien from yours, you need to use all of the tools that you can get. So, in the old days, you'd say, well, you just need to go out and watch Fox News anymore. But Fox News is now mainstream, so you need to go out and watch One American Network or stuff like that, where the crazy people live now.
Okay, thank you.
But it's still priming. I mean, you're priming yourself. It's intentional, reflective priming, because some of these things are stuff that it's hard to shift just within a purely reflective manner. So you need to supplement your reflection.
So yeah, I mean, officially we are out of time, but we transition slowly into the round table where we can bring up questions that we hadn't had a chance to talk about in the Q&A. Hello, Kagan. So, okay. So in a way, like, yeah, picking up on the idea of rationality, it looks like sometimes in the book you talk about like the intrapersonal case where one would have, let's say, two different opponent frames on a particular topic. But as we talked about briefly, when you have two people that are so entrenched in their frames and in a sort of very, let's say, moral disagreement about issues on abortion or gun control.
Right.
The current topics nowadays. So what would be the solution there? I mean, yeah, you talk about ways of kind of getting out of the deadlock, but how do you introduce, as it were, other people across, interpersonal across frames? What do you mean?
Well, I could. I don't want to go into too much detail on stuff that's not entirely orthogonal, that's not entirely relevant to the conference. So, I mean, happy to answer that. I mean, I do have but also happy to let it drop if other people have got other things they want to explore more relevant to themes of oppression and game theory and so forth. But my basic, as it were, sort of supercharged version of skills that have been well studied by psychologists in normal contexts. So, for example, there's a lot of work in social psychology on how you decenter yourself, and it's part of cognitive behavioral therapy. So how you make how you disidentify with your most fundamental beliefs, how you move from thinking, for example, that I am furious with somebody to there is anger, and disassociate yourself. And that's an important part of cognitive behavioral therapy, getting a control on your emotional reactions. And I think that a really important part of reasoning across frames is learning how to take that attitude to your own way of framing reality, being able to decenter yourself from that. And then there's a lot of work in child psychology on how children learn to appreciate other people's perspectives on things. And that work is usually on a very perceptual basis. So how do children learn that other people can have different perceptual perspectives on the same environment? Flavel's done a lot of work on that. But thinking about other people's frames is basically the same skill, just applied to a different subject matter. How do you learn that reality can be framed and different people can be engaging with it in different ways, and so on. So I think that there are skills like that, and I've got a little diagram, but I haven't got it to hand.
If there are any other questions on previous speakers.
I'd like to raise something actually that I talked about briefly with Kevin, nothing to do with framing, but about the phenomenon you were discussing in gaslighting, because I thought that made a connection with at least one of the other papers. Maybe we could just talk a little bit about that and how people get to, how people find their perspectives on the world being manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one kind of generic connection that I didn't want to suggest because it seemed a little too far afield for the paper, but there has been some research on in economics on what's sometimes called strategic disclosure. The idea here is, I mean, they're principally interested in like companies, but how can a company manipulate the judgment of potential investors via the release of true but nonetheless misleading information, right? So the classic problem in like signaling games is I can just outright lie to you, and so why am I being honest? The interest that the economists are interested in the strategic disclosure is I'm unable to lie to you because somehow whatever I say is verifiable, but nonetheless I can sort of mislead you. And I wonder to what extent gaslighting is sometimes like that. Right, it's that I can reveal to you, if I'm gaslighting you, I'm revealing to you a collection of true facts, but ones that are attempted to get you to distrust your own inferential abilities or distrust your own beliefs or something like that. So it's not that I'm outright lying to you exactly, but that I'm sort of, strategically disclosing things.
Right, so you will second guess your beliefs because I'm giving you a partial
Right.
perspective.
Yeah. And the thing is, in the classic one of the things the economists have shown is that in the very classic Bayesian game theoretic models, it's actually pretty hard to mislead people because, if you strategically disclose information, I also know that you're strategically disclosing. And so then I can infer what things you aren't disclosing from what you are disclosing. And yes, you can mislead me a little bit, but there's some constraints on how much you can mislead me because of these common knowledge assumptions that are built in to traditional game theoretic models. But it might be that we think, well, maybe for various reasons, those models aren't appropriate in the case of gaslighting, or maybe they are, and maybe there's some interesting connection there. Sorry, it's just this total free association that I was doing during the talk, but something else.
I thought this was the free association part of the workshop anyway.
That's why I said it.
Any other questions from the participants that are left? Can't see anything in the chat. All right.
Well, I guess a question for you is, you guys have been working on the Nash demand game for a while. Have you thought of, and now we've spent a couple of days discussing that and related topics, and has this suggested any new ways of carrying that work forwards?
I think yes. In a way that the one as you put plan that I was thinking is to look indeed at combining that with network modeling, but also in a way for the purposes of my specific project of looking at what language is doing, so we have, and the model that Roland presented yesterday, we have this mixture of pre-play signaling that will preface the Nash demand game, and wondering that whether in the case of a slurring act or whatever speech act you make, whether that would involve a combination of signaling kind of in the more kind of full-fledged sense rather than just pre-play signaling. So combine that signaling game with the Nash demand game and see how it may change the payoffs. So Anton, he ran some experiments by thinking of let's say the slurring act as a sort of signaling to both population, both blues and reds. Maybe Anton, if you're still here. So in those circumstances, if I understood correctly, what the utterance will convey is simply like signaling to everyone, I'm going to play H, whatever, regardless who I'm playing with. That's a signal that I'm going to be this aggressive player. Maybe Anton, you can pick it up. So, I mean, in a sense.
So you are thinking of different kinds of games and to develop it further, how slurs can change the outcome, and especially what is the special function of slurs. So in the models that they set up, what is the problem is how to distinguish between slurs and simple insults. And if you insult somebody, then of course it's not nice, but that has no effects on society. It's just a matter between two people. And one of the big problems that we still work on is how to explain the specific contribution of a slur as a socially relevant or as something that changes something in society. And that's not so simple, and that's actually something that, as I said, we still are working on. And so this also has some more linguistic aspect then to it. But hopefully you hear about this in half a year or so.
I think in a way, it's quite, in a way, coming back to the distinction that actually, that David brought up yesterday, this distinction between a slur act as opposed to just a pejorative or any other forms of exclusionary acts. You know, how do you distinguish between them, or in particular, how do you model them encode them in Python, and it's how do you model them within the structure of the Nash demand game? And clearly, the group membership will be the differentiating factor, because slurs apply only to a particular kind of group membership, setting aside the worries that Kevin raised yesterday about other type of uses, where kind of context and pragmatics will tell you what to do, but trying to model that is kind of even harder to And also, like, in a way, what has been very inspiring for us, and in a way that's how we really started, is with the paper by Kalin and Lacroix on power by association. So to me, that has been very revealing, because I thought this is tracking what I'm interested in, the fact that you have these heterogeneous populations where only some are really powerful in terms of really having a high resources and high bargaining power, but others can, as you were, derive that bargaining power merely by association, by proxy of being in the same group. And so in the sense that like the less powerful group will learn to bid low, just because in virtue of their history of having encountered a powerful agent, and then a low bid would be the safest option. So it's interesting how then you have this compounding power effect across a heterogeneous population, merely as a result of the social learning.
One thing, I had a PhD student who just finished last year who, one of the things he looked at was not so much the ways that things like the disagreement point affect bargaining, but the shape of a utility function from the bargain outcome to private utility. So the idea was, you can think of people as being, of taking more value in larger amounts or less value in larger amounts. And he was thinking about ways that discrimination might be perpetuated in those contexts. So if you systematically get lower bargains, that you might come to expect lower bargains or to value the money less or something like that. And that, when you were just talking about slurs, that sort of came to mind, because I thought, well, I wonder if certain kinds of speech acts might cause people to actually change the way that they value the outcomes of the bargain. So it's not that they change their attitudes about disagreement points necessarily, but they just say, well, I deserve less, and so therefore my preference for more money is flatter or something like that. I don't know if that makes a big difference, or if that's interesting. Just something.
I have a little suggestion sort of related to that also, that so this idea that you can possibly change people's kind of preference curves or expectations by slurring. There's all this evidence on people under threat having different preference curves. So people who are poorer have different utility curves, and they're more risk averse in general than people who are more wealthy, and people who are otherwise insecure or under threat have the same. So they are more risk averse than those who are more wealthy. And in bargaining games, it kind of hurts you to be risk averse, because you're willing to accept lower bargains, because you put more weight on your first few steps of money, and you're not going to push for the higher but riskier bargains. So there could be some little connection there too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very useful. So in a way that would involve, because again with Anton, we were trying to think about, to model a sort of a conversation in terms of a sequential game where you would have different decisions and different payoffs at different nodes of the decision tree, and what that kind of revealed is that you could also introduce, in addition to just objective payoffs, you could introduce like one's pride, or so you have those situations like the Rosa Park where or any other cases where you sort of think like, oh, I'm going to incur cost. Let's say I will have some, injury or other type of sanctions, but pride is more important for me. So maybe one way of sort of, ranking the values would be a way to sort of to generate a change. Or would this be the idea that you have, Kevin? Sort of like the value that you put on the payoffs by kind of introducing, additional values to the payoff table. Maybe I wonder, if that's one way of sort of the way you frame your.
It can be just by additional values, or just by changing the ratio between the values. So the risk aversion option would be something like, well, you have high, medium, low, and so the traditional value, if low is 3 and medium is 5 and high is 7, well, then that gap is 2. But if you become more risk averse, well, the difference between 3 and 5 is actually subjectively to you more like only a difference of 1 rather than a difference of 2. And so that means in situations where you're confronting mixed populations, that changes your calculus. And so as a result, then it leads, if I care less about getting more than you do, then evolutionarily, it's more likely that I end up in a subservient position to you.
Yeah, that's very useful. Yeah. So I see many people kind of leaving or having to attend the family. And,
yeah, sorry.
No. I'll have some more. I just enjoyed so much your talks, and I will have to kind of probably I will pop an email later on where more clear thoughts will coalesce in my mind. But I'm very interested, in particular in the pluralistic ignorance and how that could affect kind of resistance acts, or in a way transition periods from, let's say, from a norm of inequality back to a norm of inequality, and so on. You sort of, and in particular, sort of the work indeed kind of related to the informational or reputational cascades that Cass Sunstein or Timur Kuran are talking about. Sort of how do you kind of engage that driver? So you have the rebels, the trendsetters who are willing to kind of, I jump on the bandwagon, without necessarily saying that there are many others who are ready to jump on. And then you sort of build up on that kind of increasing the group and so on. So when you see sufficiently, a critical mass of people who are ready to make the shift, then you are ready to sort of go out in public and state.
And I mean, one of the things connected to what the question that David Beer was asking, I think is right, that one of the things that I think if you are trying to initiate social change, that you can use network structure, that you want to alter the network structure, right? That is, I think that's part of the problem. And, you see lots of people talk about this, especially people that, like, for instance, I've seen it in the context of like sexual orientation and trans. People from very small communities in the United States have expressed, that like in the 90s, it became having those identities became much easier with the rise of the internet, because now they could find people where they could express their preferences in ways that weren't subject to social sanction. And so that the internet changed the social network. So whereas before your options were the people that you lived around, and if you lived in a small town in Texas or whatever, the people that you lived around were not eager to hear about those things. But once the internet is there, well, now your social network includes somebody from New York City and somebody from Berlin and somebody from, and so now you can have those conversations. And so I think that, David was emphasizing that, the introduction of different connections, especially connections that are dependent on what your beliefs are exactly the kind of things that can destroy pluralistic ignorance. Which, I didn't focus so much on that side of the question. I was really, because other people have said lots about it, but I think that altering the social network structure is one of the ways that you can do it, and also isolating people, because if you can isolate people from social influence, then exactly what you said, Michaela, that you're more likely then to be willing to express what your endogenous belief is, because you don't have social influence of others. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is in a way one way in which I was thinking how this, the echo chambers and the polarization that you see nowadays, and online increase in the networks precisely makes it possible for people to aggregate much more widely than before, and that sort of give them a sense of a comfort zone, like, we are all in it together, and look how many we are, and we're thinking the same thing, and that kind of confirmation bias.
And this is also one of the situations where I do get a little uncomfortable with the rhetoric right now, especially the academic rhetoric about polarization and all of these things, which do have bad effects. But it's polarization is just a type of homophily where like people find like people, and and so maybe again this is just a result of my age or what I was paying attention to, but just the rhetoric, the other side of that, which is revolutionaries are able to find other revolutionaries in Egypt, or people who are trans can find out information and connect with other people who are trans, even if they live in a community where they're the only person who's trans, or all these things. That's also polarization, right? That's the same phenomena. And so it's not transparent to me whether the increased fluidity of our social networks is good or bad as a whole, precisely because I think it has these different effects.
Are you sure it's the same phenomenon though, Kevin? I mean, freedom, ability to access information and to coordinate with like-minded people is one thing, but when people talk about polarization, what I think of polarization is lack of openness, and that doesn't necessarily go with the phenomenon of access to information.
Yeah, it's interesting. Polarization is tricky. Like, there's this really nice paper by
it's more than grouping, right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Actually, polarization is actually this term that actually means a bunch of different things. So maybe I'm being a little unfair because I'm focusing on just one sense of polarization. There's this really nice paper by Dan Singer, Patrick Grimm, and that very large research group where they kind of go through, like, here are, like, I don't remember how many, but they find like 15 different definitions of polarization in the literature, and they actually show how, like, the same model leads to increase in one type but decrease in another type.
Right.
So. Yeah, and so no, it's a good point, which is that some senses of polarization are not necessarily, they're not entailed by homophily. Like, I can seek out like-minded people, but not be closed-minded to people that are dissimilar from me.
Mm-hmm.
But at least one type of polarization, that is, the one that I had in mind, was the fact that it does seem as though today our informational communication lines are between people that are otherwise more like-minded. I'm less likely to hang out with a Republican today than I was 20 years ago or something like that. And that's not just because I moved from Kansas to Pittsburgh. But
in a way, that kind of brings on to the sort of, what sort of dialogue can you engage with people who are so different, are so embedded in a different frame than yours? Because it looks like, the more we are unwilling to engage in a dialogue, the more, the more apart we will be. And
well, and the first step is to realize that you're no less embedded in a frame than they are, right? Or in a.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is one.
I mean,
of
it's
the
always
things
somebody else. This is always somebody else's problem, as it's standardly discussed.
No, I totally agree, and it's one of the things that, especially, I don't know so much about Europe, but at least the rhetoric that you're finding about polarization in the United States is it's like I can't believe how polarized we are, and by that I mean I can't believe how unwilling to listen to me they are. Right, but it's never the other way. Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, obviously, right. That's I mean, it's the same old error that we always make, which is, I'm right and everyone else is wrong, and so whenever they disagree with me, it's their fault.
Well, that's why I took it the first step in that discussion relative to a notion of polarization that does involve closed-mindedness is that kind of process of decentering, where you actually start to take an external perspective on your own framing, or whatever you want to call it. Weltanschauung.
Yeah. And maybe if I may dare the final point, because I see people are probably too hungry to. So when we talk about kind of social change, what would be a kind of good advice to look for? Is sort of, are we looking for the right trendsetters that will set the good path to go for, or how do we mobilize people basically to really go in the right direction?
And that's a tricky question. I think it really, one of the things that I've sort of started to decide as I start to think about like these epistemic things is that there are very different types of epistemic pathologies, and they have very different structures, and they come about for different reasons, and they dissolve for different reasons. And so, especially when it comes to social network stuff, which is what I've been spending most of my time thinking about in the last year, I'm really convinced that, there is not a kind of one size fits all, like here's how we achieve social change, or here's how we get out of an epistemic pathology kind of answer, but really it's much more, this kind of pathology has this kind of solution, but that's different from a different kind of pathology that has a different kind of solution. And so it's much more like, in the weeds, on the grounds kinds of things of like, what is this pathology? What is its cause? And it's not like there's nothing we can say. It's not like, it's particularism or something like that, but that it really is, there are, maybe 4 or 5 different bins of different types of pathologies. And we really have to figure out which one we're in before we start thinking about either how to avoid it or how to change it or how to escape it.
Right. So an antidote for each problem.
Yeah. And so there are, you can say general things. So it's not like a radical particularism, but I mean, the thing, like the book that I'm writing right now, I'm sort of if you want to think of the big philosophical conclusion, is something like, what's the best social network for social learning? That's just not a question that has an answer, because different problems suggest different kinds of social networks, and different kinds of pathologies are brought about in different kinds of social networks. And so you have to sort of think about what kind of problem you think you're going to be confronted before you can answer that kind of question.
And not all of them are pathologies.
Yeah, right. Well,
all
exactly.
Universal pathologies, I mean.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think epistemic pluralistic ignorance is for exactly the reasons that you said, Jose, is an interesting case, because it's an epistemic pathology, but whether we think of it as a social pathology depends on whether what we're doing. Like if we're paying taxes, it's an epistemic pathology in the sense that people have false beliefs, but good, I'm glad they do. Right? I'd like to perpetuate it, maybe even increase it. But on the other hand, when it comes to, not feeding your infant child breast milk, then it's not a good pathology. It's pathological in both senses.
And resistance acts would be one way of sort of mobilizing people when sort of you're confronted with some specific harm, sort of like out, rather than indeed kind of everyone keeping silent and let it go. Understand?
Yeah, and this is something that I can't take credit for, but definitely it's something that Christina Bicarius emphasized a lot in her work on pluralistic ignorance and changing social norms. Is trendsetters are really important.
Yeah. It's super fascinating. I want to read the book. When will it be?
Oh, it'll be a while. It's about half written at this point, so I've signed a contract with OUP for it, but it was just on a proposal, so I actually have to finish writing it. But I'm on sabbatical for the spring, so my hope is to get it done.
Awesome.
Yeah, can't wait to see.
Me too.
Well, I've got to run too. So Michaela, thanks very much for.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was great.
Thank you very much. It's been such a great discussion and amazing talks. So I've learned a lot. So thank you so much for
Right,
taking
and
it.
nice to meet you, Kevin.
Yeah. Thank you for organizing. Nice to see you.
Thank
Jose.
you.
See you,
Yeah.
everyone.